Daf Yomi is Bava Basra Daf Tzadi Hey, and we're going to start in the bottom of Tzadi Dalad Amar Beis, and the Gemara is in the middle of a discussion of the sugya of the fact that Rav Huna taught that if a person, even though the seller is not responsible for up to a quarter kav of inferior produce in a sale of wheat, if he put in more than that, then the purchaser is entitled to reimbursement for everything, including the quarter kav of inferior product. So the Gemara is discussing whether or not Rav Huna is correct. The Gemara is trying to prove for Rav Huna is correct from a brisa, from a statement of Rav and Barav Nachman on a Mishnah. That basically the Mishnah talks about a case where somebody says to his friend that he's selling him a base core of land. And a base core is an area that has 30 saw. And the land is then measured and it's found more than a base core. So the Mishnah, as taught by Rav and Barav Nachman, says that if it's not more than a quarter of a kav per base saw, i.e. not more than 7.5 kavim, then he's entitled to keep the amount to keep the extra amount that he was given. But if it's more than that, then he has to return it. So the Gemara says, the Tani Rav Barav Nachman, if it's more than that, not only does he return the extra, the whatever's past 7.5 kavim, but El Master was called he has to return all of it, even up to all the quarter kavim, even all the ones up to 7.5 kavim. How we see from here, when you have to return something, just like Rav Huna taught, you return everything. Gemara says the two cases are not the same. You think this case is the same as that? In that case over there, the buyer, the only reason why he's getting extra land is because the seller said to him, I'm selling you this land, less or more, meaning to say he wants to sell in the field even if it's a little bit unexact. So if it's a quarter kav extra per piece, then he's not counting it, and so therefore he's willing to sell it. He's willing to waive it. But yes, or Revia, but if it's over this quarter on top of Tzadi Hey Amid Aleph, then he's going to be considered significant. That because since this quarter calves are basically able to be added on to make it added on to become significant by becoming part of the 9 kavim, then he'll consider it significant, and therefore he's returning it. So basically, in the case of Rav Huna, the reason why he says a quarter of kav I'm forgiving is because he didn't say less or more, and so therefore it's possible that if it's more than that, Rav Huna might not be correct when he says you have to return everything. But here in this case, he said I'm doing this more or less, but if it's much more than that, then for sure he'd have to return everything. So the Gemara still has not proved Rav Huna. So the Gemara is going to try and prove it from the following case. If you charge less than a sixth, the sale is valid, and he's not entitled to anything. The seller, even though he's not supposed to do that, he's not entitled to anything back. But if he charges more than a sixth, then the sale is going to be canceled. Shtus, but if it's an extra sixth, kana, then the sale is valid. He only returns the anah. He only returns the overcharge. So the Gemara says, but why? Why doesn't he say just have to return in the case where the sale is more than a sixth? Why is the sale canceled? Let him just return it until it's less than a sixth. So therefore, this is a challenge to Rav Huna. Because this is a support for Rav Huna because he's saying the whole sale is canceled was short more than a sixth, and you don't want him to just return that little bit. Don't we learn from here? Wherever you have to return something, you return everything. Gemara says, no, it's not a proof. Two cases are not the same. In that case over there, Meikara, that at the outset, Shava b'Shava Amrei. In that case over there, at the outset, the seller told the buyer that the value is equal to what he paid. Over there, he told him, Mikar Shava Shava Amrway, meaning to say the buyer wasn't expecting to overpay at all, and so therefore it's way too much. He returns everything. Miu Pachos Mishtus Lo Yadia B'mana. Less than a six, you don't recognize it. Machal Inish, a person forgets it because it's such a minor thing. Shtus Yadia V'lo Machal Inish. If it's a six, then people recognize it and they don't waive it. And Yoser Mishtus Mekach Toso. If it's more than a six, the whole sale cancel bottom Mechach, and the whole sale is nullified. But that's not Rav Huna's case, because in Rav Huna's case, it's not that he doesn't recognize it. It's that he waives it because it's from the beginning it's recognizable for the grain to have this inferior product mixed in. So therefore, it's a totally different scenario. So the Gemara says Tashma, Amakabel Sada Michavero Huita. So let's say somebody accepts a field from his friend. So again, we're going to try and prove whether or not Rav Huna is correct. So we're going to prove it from the following case. You get the field from your friend to plant it with trees. So somebody gets a field and his friend hires him to plant the trees. Then he accepts upon himself to plant 10 trees for every 100. That's your responsibility. Meaning to say that there will be the guy who hired him knows he's going to give him 10 bad trees for every 100 planted. It's not, if the trees don't bring out fruit, it's not the planter's responsibility. So then the Gemara says, Yoser Mikan, if there are more of the trees in this that don't produce anything, Magalgo and Olavis a coal. Then the contractor has to pay for everything. So we see from here that this is directly like Rav Huna. So Amar Rav Huna, Braid Rav Yeshua, Kol Yeser Mikan Kevalo Itam Mitzchilo Dami. So he says this is not a good proof. Why? Because anytime you have more than 10 trees that are found to be barren, we're going to say it's as though he's starting over. And so therefore, he has to plant all of the trees. And whereas Rav Huna was saying that in Rav Huna's case, we don't necessarily have to draw that conclusion because we might say that it will force him to accept a quarter kav even more than a quarter kav is found. So that's the difference. Meaning to say that in the case of the trees, since the space occupied by 11 trees is an area large enough to form a field in its own right, then the planter is looked at as if he had a separate obligation to plant the field with 11 trees. And so if he undertakes such an obligation, he couldn't plant one field and look at the rest, leave it as unplanted. So the Gemara doesn't bring a final answer. But now we learned in the Mishnah that if you have a cellar of wine, we assume that 10 of the bottles are bad. Hey, what is the case of the sale? How did the sale take place? Being say, what did he say? The Amrle Martev Shal Yain Stam. If the case was where, hold on. If he said, I just want a cellar of wine, and he didn't say that's all the language he used, kasha, then it's difficult because, and the Gemara is going to tell us what the difficulty is. If he wants this cellar of wine, kasha, it's also difficult. If he just says this cellar, kasha, what did the seller say? It's all difficult. What's the problem with each one? The Tanya. I'm selling you a cellar of wine. No single yayin shekul yafa. You have to give him all good. You can't give him any bad ones. If he says this wine I'm giving to you, no single yayin anim kabrachanas. You can give him the wine that's going bad, even the stuff stolen in the store on the expiration date. He says I'm selling this seller without mentioning wine. I feel cool chomo to good. You can even give him vinegar. So what's the case? What was the language that he used to sell it? So Gemara says, he just says a seller of wine. Vitani Bereisha de Braisa. And the Brisa should be reading and saying, Mikabo of Ezer Kos Solomea. He has to give him good wine, but the buyer accepts upon himself that even though he has to give him good wine, 10 of the barrels will become sour. Ubistami Mikabo, and so the Gemara says, where the seller said, I'm selling you just a cellar of wine, does he have to accept any sour wine? No, you have to give him wine that's all good. So do we see that's different? So the Gemara says, no, Shani Chavis, a barrel is different. The Kulo Chavis Chamro, because the Kulo Chad Chamro, all the wine in that barrel is the same. And so therefore, since the buyer doesn't have to take an entire barrel of souring wine, so therefore that whole barrel must be good. Mar says, "Vatani Rav Zvid debated Rabbi Yoshaya, Martev Shal Yain and Imocher Loch Nozen Lo Yain Shekol Yafa, Martev Zeh Shal Yain Imocher Loch Nozen Lo Yain Shekol Yafa, Makabo Eser Kosos Someya." So the Gemara says, but we have a different contradiction because the price says, if I'm selling you this seller of wine, he has to give him wine that's all good. He says, Martev Zeh Shal Yain, this seller of wine, then no telo yain shekul yafu makabo of aser kosos someya. So we see from here that if he says a seller of wine, he has to give him all good. And v'zeu oter, but the second case, this is the storehouse sheshanu chacham mishnah seinu that the sage just spoke in our Mishnah, meaning to say, when he says, I'm selling you this seller of wine, where I'm selling you this seller of wine, he doesn't have to accept any bad wine. Whereas the Brisa says that the Mishnah says, I'm selling you this seller of wine, and that's where he has to accept the 10 bad ones. So we have to amend the text or Mishnahs where he says this seller. Well, Kasha is out, but then we have a contradiction. Because the first case it says I'm selling you this, then he has to give him all the wine that he could even give him wine that's going bad, and here he can only give him 10 bad ones. The Gemara says, "Well, Kasha, it depends where the seller said to the buyer that the wine was okay for cooking, and that's in the case. That's in the case where and and the other cases where he didn't say to him that it was okay for cooking. For the case of Rav Zvid, where he said to him the wine is suitable for cooking, so he doesn't have to accept any bad wine. Right? So the first case refers to a case where he didn't say to him that it's good for cooking, so he has to accept even the souring wine. Let's say he takes a cellar of wine and he says to him, it's for cooking. He has to give him all wine, which is good. But he says this cellar, and he says it's for cooking. He has to give him wine that's all good. And accepts upon himself 10 barrels per 100. But he says this cellar of wine, and he doesn't say for cooking, he has to give him wine that's in the shops. You can even give him wine in the shops. Gemara says, but let's say he says, I'm giving you a cellar of wine, and he didn't say to him that it's good for cooking. What's the law? Gemara says, one he says he accepts it, the other says he doesn't. One who says he accepts it, he rules it from Rav Zvid. What did Rav Zvid say? And if he says, I'm selling you a cellar of wine, he gives him wine that's all good. And he has to give him wine which is good. And we establish it that it's for cooking. Because he said it's for cooking. But if he didn't say for cooking, he can accept it. He learns it out from the Brisa. We establish it where he didn't say it's for cooking. Gemara says, the one who words out from the Zvid, how would he explain the Brisa? So he would have to amend the text. Where he said it's for cooking. he would accept it if he didn't say it's for cooking, accepts it 10%. And this seller of wine, he didn't say for cooking. No, so it gives him wine that's sold in the shops. And one who infers it from the Bryce, it's difficult for us vid. So Gemara says, we didn't say from the Kabul, he has to accept it. Gemara says, but it's the same case, even though he didn't sell it for cooking. He doesn't have to accept it. The reason why we said it's where he accepted it for cooking is because otherwise it's contradicted. Now the Gemara says, what's the bracha we make before drinking souring wine? Even if the wine is sold in the store, it's going bad. We still make the blessing and bori pregafen over it. Rav Chizda Amar Gave Chamra de Akrim Lamali. Why should I recite the blessing over wine that's soured? You don't make the blessing in bori pregafen sour. You just make a shackle. And more challenges Rav Yehuda. Meisvei al pasha ipshav al yayin shehikrim al tav shel sha'avra tzurasa omer shakol ni'abedvaro. How can Rabbi Yehuda say that you say bori pregafen? You say bread that's moldy and wine that's soured and a food item that's spoiled, you still say shahakol. Amar Azid Moda Rabbi Yehuda beportzima de mizben hakarnat. Rabbi Yehuda would agree if it's wine that was made from kernels, which was sold on the street corners. That's certainly inferior. Amar about Rabbi Yosef, how Rabbi Yehuda Rav Chizda? There's Rabbi Yehuda and there's Rav Chizda. Markaman Sfirway. So Rabbi says to Rabbi Yosef, who do you agree with? So Amar Masnisin Yadana. I know a brisa from which we can get the law, the Tanya. Abodik is the chavis lios mafreshal atshuma nahoich va'achach nimtzis chometz kol gimel yom vaday mikam ve'ilch safek. And what's the brisa saying? We're going to pick that up. That's in the daf yomi for Sunday. Baruch Hashem, beautiful daf on Sunday. But now we see that Mr. Haskell is, even though the food is moldy, we still have to make a blessing of shahakol the abedvaro. We still have to blessing. We still have to make a bracha to Hashem. Okay, we'll stop here. Please stop.
Thank you.
Shikoyach.
Thank you.
Thank God.